I do hereby declare that Sarah Sienna Edwards is duly elected.
I therefore duly declare Alistair Luke Stratton elected as Member of Parliament for the Mid-Bedfordshire Parliamentary Constituency.
Two historic by-election wins for Labour. This is Politics Live. Joining me, Telegraph columnist Madeline Grant, the New Statesman's Rachel Cunliffe, Liberal Democrat MP Daisy Cooper, Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting and the Energy Minister Andrew Bowie. After those big wins, a victory lap from the Labour leader. In Mid-Bedfordshire, where they overturned a majority of over 24,000.
This really is a game changer. I mean, there is a confidence now in this Change Labour Party that we can go anywhere across the country, put up a fight and win seats that, as you say, we've never won before.
And in Tamworth, where the Conservative majority was over 19,000.
People told me that it was not possible to win this seat in this by-election, and you absolutely smashed it.
Tories make a quick exit and lick their wounds.
I'm not in any way trying to sound complacent about it. We have a lot of work to do as a government, as a party, to win those voters back to the Conservative cause.
And the Liberal Democrats are left with nothing to show for their campaigning efforts.
We're really proud of the fact that we managed to almost double our share of the vote, and we did win over the support of thousands and thousands of lifelong Conservative voters.
Well, following those two stunning victories for the Labour Party, my opening question for the panel, starting with Andrew Bowie, and thank you for coming again this morning, Andrew, keeping me company last night. Is it all starting to feel a bit like it did in the run-up to the 1997 landslide victory for Tony Blair?
I wouldn't know, because I was 9 and 10 when we were in the run-up to the election in 1997. But what I would say is, obviously, we're disappointed that Festus and Andrew are not joining us on the Conservative benches after what was an incredibly positive by-election campaign in each of the constituencies in Mid-Bedfordshire and Tamworth. We're disappointed, obviously. Yeah. But what this demonstrates is that there's no real love for the Labour Party. The Labour Party actually lost votes in Mid-Bedfordshire and only gained 800 in Tamworth. So there's no momentum really behind Keir Starmer and the Labour Party on a low turnout. What I think that demonstrates to us as a government and us as a governing party is that we have work to do to bring people back, to convince them that there is something to vote for if they do support the Conservatives. We've got some time to do that, and we will carry on focusing on delivering for the British people, taking action to deliver on their priorities. And I think if we do that, we can win those voters back who did not come out and vote yesterday.
Although Andrew was very young at the time in 1997, he obviously feels it wasn't like that. There isn't the momentum there. Do you think it is beginning to look like 1997 or the run-up to that general election victory for Labour?
Well, I think these results are extraordinary. I mean, they're historic on their own terms, in terms of the scale of the victories, the size of the swings, the largest majority overturned in history. They are also remarkable given where Labour was in 2019, when frankly people asked whether the Labour Party would continue to exist as a force in British politics. And I think the point that Keir made there in the clip, a changed Labour Party able to now offer the change the country deserves, is why we are doing so well. I don't really care what the Conservatives think about whether or not we have momentum. I mean, I think it's reflected in the results.
Do you think you're on your way to a landslide?
We're certainly not complacent, Jo. I mean, frankly, we've been around this block too many times in Labour's history, so you won't get an ounce of complacency from me or from Keir. I think what lots of decent Conservatives will be shocked by is that even after they deliver shock after shock after shock to their own side, you continue to get the breathtaking arrogance and complacency that says people just stayed at home, but they'll be back with us at the next election. Or worse still, even though they're the governing party, they just want to throw rocks at Labour. I think decent Conservatives are horrified by what they've seen happen to the Conservative Party.
Well, we'll discuss it.
And we are offering those decent Conservatives a safe home in the Labour Party to deliver the kind of change I think people are crying out for.
What do you think from a Liberal Democrat perspective? Because you'll remember at the time, Daisy, there were plenty of talks between Paddy Ashdown, the then leader, and Tony Blair about working together. Of course, that never happened because Labour won a landslide victory in 1997. But is this reminiscent?
Well, there's lots of speculation about which general election in the past the next general election will be most similar to. What I would say is that this has been one of the most unpredictable parliaments of all time. I think the election in Bedfordshire yesterday was also an incredibly unpredictable election. It certainly felt that way on the doorstep yesterday. But what the by-election yesterday did show is that the Liberal Democrats are winning over a lot of lifelong Conservative voters, many of whom would not countenance voting for the Labour Party, but would consider voting for the Liberal Democrats. And we certainly think that looking at the result yesterday, as it turns out, we think we played an instrumental role in defeating the Conservatives yesterday. And we think that points to the role that we will play at the next general election, where we very much hope to defeat lots of Conservative MPs, where Liberal Democrats are the key challengers.
Does it feel like the run-up to 97?
I was also a bit too young to remember how it felt.
Oh, you're all too young. You're all too young. But you all know your history.
But it does feel like there is a nationwide movement against the Conservative Party. And it's not just these two by-elections, it's also a trend that we saw in July with the three by-elections then. And there was so much of the discourse after those three focused on Uxbridge and South Ruislip and the fact that the Conservatives had clung on to that by less than 500 votes. And I don't think there was enough focus on the fact that there had been two massive majorities of 19,000 and 20,000 overturned, one in the north and one in the south. Now you've got another two where it's very clear that the anti-Tory sentiment is coming through. And I think there should be more focus on why that is and the votes that the Conservatives are losing, rather than the lesson that they seem to have taken from Uxbridge, which is if we just go really hard on, say, green issues, maybe we can win people back.
Do you think it's reminiscent of the run-up to 97? Comparisons are being made because of the size and scale of these historic wins for Labour, similar to by-elections during that 92 to 97 period.
Exactly, and there was one in, not in the same part of the country as the Tamworth by-election in South Staffordshire, which was also a very convincing win for Tony Blair that was registering a similar level of swing to what we're seeing this morning. I think that one area where I think Andrew has a grain of a point about people staying at... Sorry, Andrew, that sounds very harsh. You're right that Conservative-minded voters stayed at home. But the fact is that if your core vote won't come out and vote for you, then, you still end up with the same outcome. It doesn't matter if the Labour win is motivated by genuine attraction for Labour or by contempt for the Tories. The result is still the same. And another area I'd say it does feel somewhat different from what I can vaguely remember of 97, having been 5 at the time, is that the campaign was quite positive and optimistic in 1997. I can remember the really cheesy campaign videos with Tony Blair going to cast his vote while things can only get better plays in the background. And now I think this is much more of a kind of sock it to the Tory vote. Obviously, the outcome is still the same, but it feels different on that basis.
And the economic backdrop, of course, is different. But let's have a look at some of the figures for these by-election victories for Labour. We'll start with Tamworth. You'll see here, it came through first, actually, which we weren't expecting. But Sarah Edwards, the Labour MP in Tamworth, won with 11,719 votes, a majority of 1,300 or so over the Conservative Andrew Cooper. The turnout was 36%. But let's have a look at the vote share, how that translated. Labour there on 46%, the Conservatives of 41%. It was very much a two-horse race. Reform coming in at 5%, the Liberal Democrats actually lower. Let's discuss the significance. Sir John Curtis, Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University, joins us. Hello to you. John, what's the story in Tamworth?
Well, the story in Tamworth, in a sense, is a very straightforward one. It's one of a very marked decline in Conservative support, down by 26 points, with Labour up very strongly by 22 points. The Reform Party didn't fight in 2019, therefore up 5. That enabled them to save their deposit in what is a very heavily pro-Leave constituency. And the Liberal Democrats, whatever they did in mid-Bedfordshire, they only started off with 6% of the vote, but they still managed to lose 4% in this by-election. So the big story, therefore, is the swing from Conservative to Labour, 23.9%. That makes it the second biggest swing ever from Conservative to Labour in post-war by-election history. It just beat the 23.7% in Selby and Ainsley back in July.
Well, let's go to Mid-Bedfordshire, different constituency, obviously, in many, many ways, and it was much more of a three-way fight. But let's just have a look at the results for Alistair Strathern, who is now the MP, 13,872 over his Conservative rival. He got a majority of 1,192, a slightly higher turnout there of 44%. It translated into these figures in terms of vote share. You can see Labour on 34%, but the Conservatives not far behind on 31%, and the Liberal Democrats there with 23%. Labour's never won this seat before, John. What happened?
Well, here we've got a somewhat different pattern from in Tamworth. I mean, the thing that's constant is the decline in the Conservative vote. It's down by 29 points, even more than it was in Mid-Bedfordshire. So that puts it up amongst some of the highest drops in Conservative support in by-election history. But the progress is shared almost evenly between Labour and Liberal Democrats. Labour up 12 points, Liberal Democrats up 11. And that does mean, as you already pointed out, Labour only got 34% of the vote in this constituency. It's not very often you can succeed in winning a constituency under our electoral system with little more than a third of the vote. That said, it's still the case that the swing, average of the Labour and Conservative changes, is just over 20 points. And that is still enough to put it in the top 10 of swings from Conservative to Labour. But you can see this is much more the product of Conservative decline than it is of Labour advance, though non-trivial, though Labour advance was.
Right. I mean, John, we were discussing just at the beginning of the programme about whether it's reminiscent of those years 92 to 97 when John Major was Prime Minister ahead of the landslide victory for Labour. Overall, these are big wins for Labour, but how significant are the results in both constituencies in terms of looking ahead to a general election?
Well, I'm afraid I can remember 1997 all too well, Jo. I remember...
you weren't five then.
The big cry was, were you up for the defeat of Michael Portillo?
Yes,
but anyway,
yeah.
The truth is that, yes, governments lose by-elections. And sometimes governments lose, particularly Conservative governments, use by-elections spectacularly to the Liberal Democrats. But governments do not routinely lose by-elections to the opposition on swings of above 20%. But it's now happened 3 times in a matter of 3 months in this Parliament. And yes, as your panel have been discussing, the last time we saw swings of this order, and we haven't seen any since 2010, is in the 92 to 97 Parliament when there were 4 by-elections where the swing was of that order. By the way, on falls in turnout that were very similar to what we saw last night, but that didn't stop them signifying. Now, I think, therefore, what we have to conclude, given we also know what the opinion poll's saying, is that it's now very clear that the Labour Party is in as strong a position a year out from the next general election, and the Conservatives in as weak a position as was the case in 1996. Of course, there is no guarantee that history will repeat itself, but we do now know, if we didn't know it before, that Rishi Sunak faces a very substantial task to turn his party's fortunes around, a task that in the end eluded John Major back in the 1990s.
John Curtis, thank you very much. Well, the lesson's clear there from John Curtis. Governing parties don't lose by-elections to the opposition of this order, sometimes to the Liberal Democrats. It's going to be very, very difficult for Rishi Sunak to turn this round.
There are specific difficult circumstances in all the by-elections that John just referenced there. We obviously acknowledge that. And governments
these are massive swings.
By-elections. But if you look at the turnouts, I mean, 35% in Tamworth, 42% in Mid-Bedfordshire, a huge amount of Conservative voters stayed at home and decided to use this opportunity to protest, to abstain.
And you think they're all going to turn out at a general election?
Well, obviously, I can't predict what will happen in general election. I know we've got work to do to convince our voters to come out and support us. That is quite obviously the case. That means we've got to double our efforts to deliver on the priorities that people are telling us we need to deliver on, as the Prime Minister has set out, taking big, long-term decisions in the national interest.
You haven't got long, of course, have you? I mean,
well, you obviously know something I don't. I mean, I have no idea when the next election is going to be.
Let's put it this way. It's going to be next year, at the latest, January 25. It's not mid-term, is it? That's the point. We're not mid-term through a Parliament. You haven't got long. These swings are pretty dramatic.
Yeah, look, I mean, we can't deny that the swings are large, but it's also the fact governments do not win by-elections. It's also a fact that the Conservatives have not switched to Labour. Many of them did stay at home. That gives us an opportunity to win those voters back and to demonstrate to the country exactly what this government can do for them and will do for them in the future. And I have complete faith in Rishi Sunak to be able to take that message to the country and to demonstrate that we are acting on the people's behalf.
Well, let's hear from the winning candidate, now MP in Mid-Bedfordshire, and from Keir Starmer.
I and we have been really humbled by how seriously people have taken this election, this opportunity to do something different, this chance to make sure we finally have an MP in Parliament who's going to be on our side. And I think it's fair to say that after today, no one is going to be taking us for granted here in Bedfordshire ever again.
We take this incredible victory humbly. We know that voters here have voted for us and they put their trust and their confidence in a changed Labour Party, and we will repay them for that trust and confidence. We do so humbly.
Keir Starmer and Alistair Strathern. Let's catch up with our political correspondent Nick Eardley, who's been in Mid-Bedfordshire. Interesting use of the word humble, and we are going to reward the people of Mid-Bedfordshire humbly. Cautious, really, in his celebrations.
I think Keir Starmer was very keen not to get ahead of himself this morning. In another BBC interview, he talked at length about not wanting to get carried away, that there's a long way to go until the general election. There are a lot of votes still to be won. But if you look between the official lines, Joe, there are those clues about just how confident Labour are getting. Keir Starmer was also talking about this result in Mid-Bedfordshire being a game changer, saying that Labour now think there are parts of England where they've never won before, that they can win again. And I think it's pretty impossible, actually, to ignore or to fail to recognise the trend, which is, yes, you know, by-elections sometimes present freak results, but there's been quite a lot of them. There was Selby, there was Rutherglen, there was Tamworth, now there's Mid-Beds. They've all had those big swings to Labour. It's not just the result, it's the big swings as well, which are making a lot of Labour people, even if they're not saying it publicly, very optimistic.
Nick Eardley, thank you very much there in Mid-Bedfordshire. Rachel, you were on the ground, I understand,
yes.
In the constituency. Did the result come as a surprise?
It was very obvious that it was going to be close. I followed both the Liberal Democrat and the Labour campaigns. The Conservative campaign sadly didn't have time to speak to me. But the message that we got on the doorstep again and again and again were voters saying, we want to send a message to the Conservatives, but we're not sure who has the best chance of winning. Is it Labour? Is it the Liberal Democrats? And there was a huge amount of anger at the Conservative Party, not just for the last year, but these people felt ignored from the last decade, really. A lot of anger at Nadine Dorries specifically. I think my favourite quote was a voter who said she'd been as much use as a chocolate fireplace. So real anger there. But there was also concern from voters, and I think a bit from the campaigns, that anti-Tory vote could be split, and that would enable the Conservative candidate to win. So I knew it was going to be close. I knew the Conservative vote share was going to fall, but I couldn't have called it.
Right, I mean, it couldn't have called it means it was close. It was close. We can see the figures, the Lib Dems right there behind you. Was that frustrating, having the Liberal Democrats campaigning as hard as they did and taking a substantial share of the vote?
No, it's an open contest, and the Liberal Democrats had every right to put themselves forward. I must say, they did take the classic Lib Dem bar charts and graphs to the extreme boundaries of what is plausible. I mean, no wonder Rishi wants to do maths to 18 when you look at some of your ropey bar charts days, even by the Lib Dem standards.
We
like,
used
it was
the same ones in
absolutely
Chesham and Amersham
shameful.
when people didn't believe we could win, and we did win there.
But there is a point. I mean, look, the thing is, I think, you know, and you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, but like, you know, the Lib Dem argument was, there's a ceiling for Labour here and only the Lib Dems could win. Now, we didn't believe that, and our early work in Mid-Beds told us that we were the main challengers, and so we really went hell for leather for it. We had a great candidate in Alistair Strathern, who's going to be a brilliant MP. But, you know, it's not for me to tell the Liberal Democrats where they can and can't campaign. This is the point of democracy. People deserve that choice. So I don't resent the Liberal Democrats for contesting that seat. There aren't many three-way marginals like this.
No, well, that's true. Mainly they're two-way.
Fairly unique. But, you know, we know, and, you know, this comes back to the point about complacency. We know at the next general election that we can only win if people are voting for the change they want to see.
But do you think they are voting for you? I mean, there is a lot of discussion now. It's difficult to know how many Conservative voters stayed at home. There could have been Labour voters that stayed at home too. It's difficult to tell from the figures. If there isn't enough enthusiasm for Labour, or they're undecided in the way Rachel thought they were between perhaps the Liberal Democrats and Labour, that doesn't bode well in a general election, does it?
Well, I think you saw the gear change at Labour conference, and that's why we're keen to spend less time talking about the Conservatives. I think people can see what's happened in the last 13 years. What we are talking about is the 1.5 million homes we'll build, the 2 million more appointments we'll deliver to get the NHS backlog down, the 700,000 more dentistry appointments that we'll deliver, the practical change that will address the real priorities of the country. And, you know, I think what stands our conference and the Conservatives' conference in real stark contrast is that what Keir Starmer did when he became leader was take on the chin directly why Labour had lost. If Rishi Sunak was doing the same thing, we wouldn't see Liz Truss applauded at the Conservative Party conference. She'd have been told to stay away. He can't confront Liz Truss and the cranks and the crackpots and the conspiracy theorists in the Conservative Party because they didn't vote for Rishi Sunak. He doesn't have a mandate. He doesn't have the party behind him. And so you get a Conservative Party that has abandoned mainstream politics and left its voters.
They haven't abandoned mainstream politics, and that's it.
Andrew, you're guilty of this. I heard you on the Today programme, not the Today, but PM on Radio 4, and you were asked to justify Mark Harper's ludicrous nonsense about 15-minute cities. The suggestion that councils are going to regulate when people do their shopping. You know that's not true. You're meant to be a centre-right Conservative, but you no longer have the courage of your convictions and your party to stand up for mainstream Conservative values because you are terrified of the populist rump that is
Andrew,
that's what's happened, and that's why your voters are staying at home. That's why they're turning to Labour, because they don't have a mainstream Conservative party.
But they're not turning to Labour, and I think what Rishi's demonstrated in the year that he has been Prime Minister is that pragmatic centre ground conservatism that the country
wants all going really well. You heard it here first. Never mind mid-beds. Don't worry, they're doing all really well.
He's brought competence and professionalism back to Downing Street, and we've seen the country moving forward, the economy righting, inflation coming down, and us delivering on our priorities. Yeah, that's what the British people
This is the complacency,
want
Andrew.
to see.
This is why people are sick and tired of it.
Well, and actually,
we've got to work hard.
And Andrew, Haswell's got a point. I mean, let's just show you this. It was a campaign newspaper by the Conservative candidate. Today, Mid-Bed's choice. Today is Judgment Day for Mid-Bed's Green Belt. On these issues, Sunak's, barely mentioned house building in his conference speech. They're going for the wrong issues. You are going for the wrong issues. It didn't work here.
They didn't even put the logo on it. That's how ashamed the Conservatives are of their party and their brand. They didn't even put their logo on it.
We were very proud of their candidate. Festus was running a fantastic campaign, and he actually garnered a lot of support on the doorsteps and indeed at the ballot box. It wasn't enough, and that's why he's not going to be joining us on the Conservative benches, which is a shame. But I'm very proud of the campaign that we ran in both Mid-Bedfordshire and Tamworth, and I'm very proud of the programme that Rishi has, and we'll be hearing more about in a couple of weeks' time at the next King's speech for the next few years.
Did Rishi Sunak learn the wrong lesson from Uxbridge and South Ruislip? Having held on to it on that one issue when it came to the ultra-low emission zone being expanded into outer London, decided then to go on things like net zero. It didn't actually help, particularly on the issue of house building in Mid-Bedfordshire.
Well, what I think on that is that it's being framed as kind of an eco-only issue, but that really does tap into the cost of living big time, which is an issue that voters is possibly the number one issue. And, I think that some of the slight alteration of individual net zero targets while keeping the overall 2050 legislation as it is, that is not something radical and drastic. I mean, I think that was the right decision. But, yeah, in terms of learning the wrong lessons, I think perhaps I wouldn't say it's a crumb of comfort for the Tories, but having lost both of these today, I think if they'd clung on to one of them, it might still have been a terrible result for them. But it would have given grist to the mill of people who were saying, actually, it's fine, nothing to see here. It would have prevented the denialism. But these results really are so terrible that, there's no good way to spin them.
Well, let's go to the next one then, which is Tamworth. And hear from Sarah Edwards, who is now the Labour MP, and again, Keir Starmer. Or maybe not. No, we seem to have lost those clips. We'll try and play them in just a moment. We're going to try and talk to our chief political correspondent in Tamworth too, Henry Zeffman. I don't know, Henry, if you can hear me. Otherwise, we'll talk to our guests in the studio. Henry, are you there?
Hi.
Yes, you are. How worried should the Tories be following on from their loss in Tamworth?
Extremely worried, I think. This was a huge victory for the Labour Party, the second biggest swing from Conservative to Labour in a by-election since the end of the Second World War. And I think it'd be ridiculous for the Conservatives not to be worried about that. I think one particular reason, though, step away from the statistics, one particular reason why the Conservatives should be worried is because this seat voted very strongly to leave the European Union in 2016. And we saw in the 2019 general election all these parts of the country that voted strongly for Brexit turning away from the Labour Party. And so if Labour can win back votes somewhere like here, if Brexit just isn't that big of an issue anymore, or Keir Starmer's reassured them on that, or whatever it may be, well, then there's a lot of other parts of the country that are then in play in the general election whenever that comes.
Right, and their candidate did seem to run off rather quickly. Obviously disappointed, but what happened there?
Well, I think what we've seen happen, basically, which was that the Labour victorious candidate, Labour MP, as she now is, began her speech, and the second she began on the stage, the Conservative candidate walked, or sort of rushed, off a back entrance. Not a great look, really, but I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of defeated candidates across the country in elections gone by who can empathise with the feeling of dejection, feeling of rejection, and I think probably testifies to the fact that the Conservative Party really should not have lost this seat. This is not a seat that the Labour Party needs to win a general election majority. It's not a seat, in fact, that the Labour Party needs to win quite a big general election majority. This is way down the Labour list of target seats, and so I'm sure there were a lot of Conservative activists, up to and including their candidate, who were pretty shocked to be rejected by the voters of Tamworth in the by-election yesterday.
Henry Zeffman, thank you very much there in Tamworth. I think we can now hear from the winning candidate, now MP, Sarah Edwards and Keir Starmer.
It's quite something. I mean, we've worked incredibly hard. I'm very, very proud of all of the team and the campaign team and everybody that's turned out for Labour and said that they want change. It is an absolutely amazing flag to be flying. People are fed up of the Conservatives, and they have proved that here in Tamworth.
People told me that it was not possible to win this seat in this by-election, and you absolutely smashed it. What a result, what a piece of history that you have been part of. And I think what you've seen here replicates what's going on across the country. People are fed up to the back teeth with 13 years of decline under this government.
I mean, Andrew Bow, would you agree Brexit now doesn't seem to be featuring much as an issue in the way it was years ago, and the Tories benefited from that? You've now got a Labour Party winning in areas like Tamworth, which does show a trajectory for other similar towns in the West Midlands.
I think we've got to bring it all back to turnout. I mean, the turnout in Tamworth was appalling at 35%. It was incredibly...
It wasn't appalling. You get low turnouts in by-elections.
35% is almost a record low turnout for a by-election. And I think that what that demonstrates is that, no, the people of Tamworth are not convinced that Labour have eschewed their Remain credentials. We delivered Brexit back in January 2020, and we're delivering the benefits of Brexit right now. Keir Starmer, let us not forget, was Jeremy Corbyn's Brexit advisor, who stymied every opportunity they had to work with us to actually get Brexit delivered through the chaos of the 2019 Parliament. He denied the opportunity to do so. So look, no, I don't think that the argument regarding Labour and Brexit has been won. I think that's why so many people stayed at home as they did, and I do genuinely believe that these people who stayed away were sending a signal that they are frustrated, that they need convinced, but that they are willing to give us an opportunity. And if we can demonstrate to the people of this country over the next few months before the general election that we are delivering for them and taking forward their priorities, that those people will come back to the Conservative Party.
It was all about low turnout.
So I could barely hear Andrew over the sound of the scraping of the barrel there. I mean, this is. I'm going to leave the Conservative script to themselves. We know that in the next 12 months or so in the run-up to the election, the task that we need to do is to persuade people that change is possible. So I think there's lots of people who've had the hope beaten out of them in this country, that politics can be a force for good, and secondly, that Labour is the vehicle for that change. And we will do that by not getting drawn onto their script and their message, but actually by making the case for the 1.5 million more homes that we want to build, to make the case for getting the NHS back on its feet and fit for the future with 2 million more appointments to get the backlog down, 700,000 more dentistry appointments so that children aren't turning up. being admitted to hospital with rotting teeth, as is happening today. It's with that positive case, the positive policies, fully costed, fully funded, that we will be able to win that argument. And this would not have been possible without the change that we have led in the Labour Party. And this is the Conservatives' worst nightmare. That's why you've got people like George Osborne pulling their hair out, who's actually masterminded Conservative election campaigns, because he knows that the biggest threat to the Conservative Party is a mainstream Labour Party that's reaching from the centre-left right across the centre ground, building a big tent, inviting people in, building the future for the country, just as the Conservative Party abandons the centre ground and this gets swept off by the populists of its right-wing flank.
I think Andrew needs to go and speak to some of those voters who decided to stay at home, because I spoke to a lot of them in mid-Bedfordshire, and what I heard from people was they think that many people now think that everything in this country has been so broken by the Conservatives, they're not sure that anybody can fix it, and that's why they stayed home. And there is a huge job now for opposition parties, including the Liberal Democrats, to set out our plans as to how we can fix the NHS, tackle the cost of living, and prove to the British public that there is a brighter future, that we can change the country, things can be fixed, but it starts by getting rid of this Conservative government.
All right, well, let's have a look at the figures again in Tamworth, because actually Liberal Democrats were beaten by the Reform Party, you can see, on 1,373 votes. So John Curtis said last night that there is the possibility of a pincer movement here, because if you look at the majority that was won by the Labour candidate, 1,316, if those votes that went to the Reform candidate had gone to the Conservatives, you might have actually held on to that seat. In response, let's see, Richard Tice from Reform had this to say as a result. Twice in same night have Reform Party UK ensured Tories lost their seat with this by-election result. This despite huge squeeze pressure from Tories to voters saying do not vote Reform. Well, let's speak to one of the party's representatives, Alex Phillips. Hello to you, Alex.
Hello, good afternoon, Jo.
Good afternoon. You got 5% of the vote share or less in both constituencies. Isn't Richard Tice exaggerating somewhat?
Well, look, I think what's important, Jo, is you've invited me onto this programme to talk about reform. So this, to me, shows that we're on the cusp of something changing here. And as you know, viewers might not necessarily know, but as you know, that I was involved in UKIP 10 years ago. And I've seen this change happen in 2013 with UKIP as well. The two-party system, the two legacy parties are not appealing to voters anymore. When you've got over 50% of the voter at staying at home and not wanting to vote for anybody, it shows that they want alternative politics. The problem we have is a legacy inherited system that forces voters into a binary choice, and what you end up with is political disenchantment.
Well, on that basis, Alan, just to interrupt you, are you going to stand candidates in every single seat in the general election?
Yes, that is absolutely the plan, because, of course, you need to do that in order to get media coverage, for one. And it's very difficult for a party of our size, as a sort of brand new party, to actually facilitate those sorts of things. The level of administration, the bureaucracy you need to go through to be able to try and stand on the same platform as the Conservative and Labour parties.
Well, let me just get a response. I mean, does that worry you, Andrew? I mean, that is an example of where they weren't enough votes to deprive you of holding on to that seat.
Yeah, it doesn't worry me in the least. We've seen this all happen before. We saw in 2014 defections and by-elections that we actually lost to UKIP candidates in the run-up to 2015 election. Those constituencies then came back to the Conservative
They stood aside in 2019.
Not in 2015. Not in 2015. And the reference there was to 2013 and the rise of UKIP, and there was defections and by-elections. The Conservatives went on to win those seats back in the 2015 election. We've got a lot of work to do to convince people that they can vote for us and they can trust the next Conservative.
Do you need to convince Alex?
Well, I don't know if I'll be able to convince Alex not to vote Conservative, but we can, I think, convince people out there that we are the choice to deliver the future that this country needs. Right. And indeed, that if they want to stop a Labour government, then their vote should go for the strong Conservative candidate standing in their area.
Right, well, Alex, can you be persuaded not to stand?
If I could interject here, this is the same old scenario we see every single time. I feel like I live in the twilight zone after 10 years in politics. The Conservatives feel they own a vote. They think that they own the right wing of politics and that there shouldn't be contenders because this gifts a Labour government.
But you did stand aside in 2019, though. you know, they stood
listen,
aside
yeah,
because you thought it was.
We did stand aside, gave them the biggest majority they've had in a long time, and look what they've done with it. They played parlour games in Parliament, and voters are sick to death of it. But what I would call upon is this idea that when the Conservatives are challenged in their own backyard, that actually they still win anyway. What you need is the Conservatives to be challenged in their own backyard, for them to remember they're supposed to be right-wing politicians and move to where most of their voters are.
Let me put that.
When
Let me
they're not
put. No,
challenged,
let me
they
put
miss
that.
things up.
Well, she's doing you a service, a good service here.
Yes, and we're very grateful. No, look, honestly, we understand absolutely that we've got a fight on our hands to convince traditional Conservative voters to stick with us. We've been in power for 13 years. If we were going to go ahead and win the next general election, it would be a historic fifth election victory. Nobody has done that before. We are determined that we've got the plan to do that. We are determined we've got the policies to do that. And I think when it comes to the general election, we'll be taking the fight to anybody that stands against us in any constituency around the UK, and we will deliver the victory that this country so desperately needs.
Are Reform UK a threat to the Conservatives?
Well, they're definitely a threat to the Conservatives. Their progress is obviously very much hampered by the first past the post system, and actually today's results have been a blow to that, because obviously the better the Lib Dems do, the worse Labour do, the greater the chance that they would have to team up and possibly make concessions to the Lib Dems in order to get things through Parliament. But the less likely that is, the less likely any kind of reform of the parliamentary system is. But one lesson I think that's really key, and it's probably true of all parties across the spectrum, if you look at the last few years of politics, it very much suggests that the era of kind of party loyalty and tribalism has died. When I think of some of the seats that went blue in 2019, Bolsover, Blythe Valley, Sedgefield, and now Tamworth, the seat where Robert Peel founded the modern Conservative Party, has gone red. What that suggests is that obviously, you know, if voters feel betrayed, they might also, you know, they're very willing to vote in a way that would have been anathema to previous generations. And on the Brexit point, if I think that if the reasons people voted for Brexit are ignored by whoever is in charge, then they could be similarly punished by the electorate.
Well, and party loyalties are diminishing, aren't they, Alex? Because Nigel Farage, who helped found your party, however, yesterday was quoted saying, "I'd be very surprised if I were not Conservative leader by 2026. Very surprised. He's not that interested in reform, is he?
No, he is. He's still our president. He's playing a very clever political game. What I want to point out, and actually it's very interesting, this talk about the binary system we have in first past the post. If we end up in a scenario where Labour has a big majority, I don't think that's going to happen. But if they get a big majority, then the idea of proportional representation is not on the table. The closer the next election gets to this sort of dissipation of voting, because people are fed up with the legacy parties, the closer we get to a political system that actually represents the views of the electorate. And you just have to look at big changes that have happened in Europe. Big change comes when electoral systems allow big changes to happen. And what I look forward to in the next election is that being on the table, something I think the Lib Dems would strongly agree with.
Oh, yes, I'm sure they would, very much so. There is a feeling of déjà vu, as we were talking about 1997.
On one thing, I do not think that Nigel Farage will be leader of the Conservative Party in 2026.
You don't, but
no,
thank you for clarifying that. Alex Phillips, thank you very much. But on that point, yes, proportional representation. I mean, not a chance if Labour win and win big.
Well, proportional representation has been in the Liberal Democrat manifesto since the party was founded, and for many years before then. It'll be in our manifesto again, and it's one of the priorities for Liberal Democrats. But, at the moment, when we speak to residents, when I speak to residents in St Albans, mid Bedfordshire, wherever it is in the country, what people are telling us is they want political parties to focus on the crisis facing our NHS and the cost of living crisis. And that's why Liberal Democrats have set out our plans to tackle both.
Rachel, what do the Tories need to do to change the weather? Can they change the weather?
I'm not sure they can, barring some kind of national disaster on a level with, say, the pandemic. I think that the lesson that they got from the by-elections in July seems to have been to move more to the right, and you do have Conservatives today going, actually, if we move further to the right, we would take the reform vote, and we would have won on those by-elections. And I think that is the wrong lesson. 13, 14 years is a really long time to be in power. And what is very clear, particularly from Tamworth, is that the Brexit coalition that won the Conservatives that majority in 2019, and that was said at that time to have redrawn the electoral map, perhaps for a generation, that isn't holding anymore. Brexit isn't the key issue. And that is going to cause a significant challenge to a party that has spent the last 5 years focusing primarily on Brexit.
Madeline, what do you think? I mean, if you look at some of the issues, stop the boats, protect the green belt, anti-strike legislation, is it going to be enough to work?
I think they're very, very limited in the number of levers they can pull, and also just the the contempt that many people have for the Conservative Party. And I think, I do feel sorry for Rishi Sunak in some ways, because he is partly being punished for things that are not his fault. He's being punished for decisions. I mean, even these 2 by-elections are all to do with the detritus of the Boris Johnson
but I
era.
suppose he has been part of those governments too.
Well, yes, but, he resigned after all and helped trigger the downfall of Boris Johnson. And obviously, I mean, part of the reason our economy is in the state that it's in is because of lengthy lockdowns. In fact, there's hardly a leader who was in charge of any country around the world during lockdown who is still in charge today. So but ultimately, the people will blame whoever is currently in charge.
Well,
and, them's the breaks.
Absolutely, as the system works. But Rishi Sunak's not to blame. It's not really his fault, particularly these 2 by-elections and the reasons behind them.
I don't quite buy that, given he was Chancellor and responsible for so many other policies. But here's the crux of it, as far as I'm concerned. You look at leaders in recent history who've led their parties from opposition.
Been quite a few. Oh, from opposition, but yeah.
You've got Tony Blair, who changed his party to get permission to change the country. David Cameron changed his party in order to get permission to change the country. Now Keir Starmer has changed the Labour Party to get permission to change the country. And Rishi Sunak's problem is he made a change pitch to the country, but he has not and is unable to, literally has no mandate or authority to, change his party now to get permission for an unprecedented 5th term. That's his fundamental problem. Keir Starmer has changed the Labour Party. That's why we are in a position to go to the country with confidence and say we've got the team and we've got the policies to give Britain its future back. But we're not complacent about that. But you can only offer change to the country if you've shown you can change the party. And how extraordinary that in his conference speech, Rishi Sunak chose to distance himself from David Cameron, the successful election-winning leader, and say nothing at all about Liz Truss, who crashed the economy, was being cheered to the rafters by these Conservative Party members. And as for Nigel Farage, he already is the leader of the Conservative Party. They're dancing to literally dancing to his tune. Literally
well, a reference to the party conference with Priti Patel dancing at a party conference. Let me get you to comment on this. David Frost, former Brexit minister. The Tamworth and Mid-Beds by-elections, he writes in a tweet, are extremely bad for my party, and I don't think it helps to suggest otherwise, as some party figures have done this morning. The current polls are dreadful for us, but these results are even worse. If your voters don't want to come out and vote for you, then you don't win elections. It's as simple as that, Andrew.
Yeah, look, we're not. We take absolutely on the chin.
Have you really understood the depth of defeat, is what David Frost is saying, and obviously wanting to see some change? Yeah. Does there need to be a radical change?
Look, we absolutely recognise there is frustration out there is scepticism out there, and people want to give us a bloody nose in these by-elections. They have done. We'll obviously take notice of that.
Yeah.
But what I think
how will you
really
take
want,
notice of it? Because it's probably going to open the floodgates to an awful lot of people within the Conservative Party coming up with helpful ideas about what you should do. We've seen it already, and that's only going to increase, isn't it?
No, look, I think what we need to do, and I think that what the country expects us to do, is to redouble our efforts, to focus on delivering on the priorities of the British people, to take those tough decisions that are in the national interest, to rebuild trust, to rebuild our economy, to have inflation, to move this country forward. That's what the Prime Minister is focused on. That's what the entire government is focused on. That's what I'm focused on. And I know that's what the Conservative Party will do over the next few months.
I mean, the question will be, do you feel better off? Do you feel better off when voters go to the polls at the next general election? The answer now would be no. Madeleine, how would voters answer that question after 13 years and looking at the economic backdrop?
Well, absolutely right. Rachel said it. I mean, yeah, that is the number one issue. It's the economy, stupid, and the economy is now in such a difficult state for so many reasons. But under the Conservative government, that they've been left with very few options now to address the problems in the economy.
And I would say that came up on the doorstep repeatedly in Mid-Bedfordshire, the cost of living crisis and the NHS crisis. My colleague who reported from Tamworth, she said the same thing. Brexit didn't really come up. The culture war issues that the Conservatives seem determined to play on didn't come up. It was all about the economy and all about the NHS.
And that's why in the top 5 priorities the Prime Minister set out to tackle is having inflation, growing the economy, cutting debt and cutting waiting lists.
But that's not really what the conference was about a couple of weeks ago.
Right, and
he is achieving.
We've
Remember,
literally got 20 seconds, but you're going to inherit all this if you win the next general election without any money to spend.
It will be hard if we win the next general
impossible,
election.
one might say.
That, and that's why we're being careful about the promises we make, so we know they're promises that we can keep.
Yes, cautious. That's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me after a very long night. But everyone looks bright and breezy. I'll be back on Monday with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. Have a good afternoon.